I want to talk a little bit about a concept called interval inversion. And what I mean by that, if we're talking about interval names, is this. Uh, if you have a note that's a second, and we're not going to be talking about major seconds, minor seconds yet, I'll do that in just a minute. We have an interval of a second. We'll just say the note C to the note D. That's the interval of a second. And if I take that interval and invert it, in other words, I take the bottom note and move it to the top. Here's C to D, and we go D up to C. This, like we said, is the interval of a second. This, if we count, this is going to be the interval of, we start here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. This is the interval of a seventh. And what that means is that seconds always invert to sevenths. And we take another interval. There are other intervals we can do that. So seconds invert to sevenths. And I'll write seconds invert to sevenths. And if we take the interval of a third, we go G to B. There's a third. Invert that. So take the bottom note, put it on top. B up to G. Well, we said this is a third. G to B is a third. We invert it. We measure up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that tells us that thirds always invert to sixths. And another one, we have our fourths. If we take the interval of fourths, C to F, that's a fourth. Don't have to worry about perfect or not. But fourth, we have the interval of fourth, C to F. Let's invert it. Take the C and move it on top. And we get the interval of a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, a fifth. And we also know that that's a fifth because you have a line note. Skip a line to the next line. That's always a fifth. So fourths invert to fifths. So seconds invert to sevenths, thirds invert to sixths, fourths invert to fifths, and if you want to get really precise here, we'll talk about one other interval we've talked about, and those are unisons, or a prime, or a 1 is another way to say that. We have the note E and E, two E's, that's a unison. If we want to invert that, take one of the E's and move them up, it's sort of obvious, we end up with E's an octave apart. And so that's a perfect octave, or eighth. So unisons invert to octaves or eighths, fourths to fifths, third to sixths, seconds to sevenths. And you can see 2 plus 7 is 9, 3 plus 6 is 9, 4 plus 5 is 9, 1 plus 8 is 9. So if you add those two together, you always get 9. So if you're thinking about thirds, you forget what they invert into, subtract it from 9, you get 6. So thirds to sixths. Now, those are the number designations of the intervals. The more specific, major, minor, perfect, all those sorts of things, those work in the inversion kind of realm as well. Let's look at perfect fourths, perfect fifths. Let me go back to that CF I had for the fourth. C to F. We decided that was a fourth. That's also a perfect fourth in this case because the accidentals match. If we invert this, we get a fifth, and we know the accidentals still match, so that's a perfect fifth. Perfect fourths always invert to perfect fifths. If you look at unisons, we had the E, two E's, invert one to the other octave. That's also perfect. Perfect unison to perfect octave. So perfect intervals always invert to perfect intervals. Always. They always do. It works in no other way. Now, let's get a little more specific back at those seconds. If I talk about the C to D interval, we decided that was a second. That, in this case, is a major second. C, 2.5 steps up to D. That's a major second. If we invert this, we get D to C. That seventh is also known as a minor seventh. And it just so happens, when you're dealing with these seconds and sevenths and thirds and sixths, major intervals always invert to minor. And vice versa, minor always invert to major. Always. And just to go a little bit farther, we haven't gotten into the diminished and augmented intervals, but they work the same way. If you have a diminished interval, it will always invert to an augmented interval, and vice versa. Augmented intervals always invert to diminished. And just keeping on going, we haven't talked about this yet still, but doubly diminished intervals invert to doubly augmented. Doubly augmented intervals always invert to doubly diminished. So we'll get to those a little bit later. But that will help you a little bit with interval inversion. And that's that for that one.